So if you're somebody who's already over in the Sanctuary Discord, you might have been made aware of this, but Ava, a recent addition to Maxroll, made me aware that while they were testing different things, they basically found out that Gloom, the passive for Darkness Necromancers, just doesn't work right on bosses and only gives us half the bonus that it's supposed to be giving us. So I had to sit here and subject my chat to just about 3 hours and 40 minutes of me individually recording hundreds of data points of me attacking these test dummies to see whether or not there was any validity to that claim. And here's the TLDR. Gloom actually only gives about half of its bonus when you're attacking a boss. So where you're supposed to gain 18% damage against them, you're only gaining about 9% damage against them. Now, there's a lot more to it than that. I have a weird little speculation point that I also kind of want to share with people, and it kind of deals with why things like Frenzy, Dead, and Disobedient suck as well. And in general, I just want to show you how I got to the conclusions that I did. And again, thank you very much, Dava, for tuning me into this, because it's not something that's immediately apparent. But as you sit here and look at the data points, you realize we've just been getting scammed out of damage, and that sucks. But let's go ahead and jump into it. So again, just for slightly more detail for people who may not be aware of how Gloom works, it's very simple. As you attack a target, it's going to apply a debuff to the target. It's not a buff that you see on yourself, but it adds on 6% damage, and it stacks up to 3 times. So as long as you maintain your stacks, which lasts for 2 seconds, you can have a total of 18% bonus damage, which is a pretty big increase in overall damage to a target. Considering the fact you can also put on +3 ranks to Gloom, you can actually get up to a whopping 36 bonus damage against a target. That's basically like the Flesh Eater node, which effectively every single Necromancer build is running nowadays, all in a single passive. What it requires you to do is hit a target with a darkness skill, and then any shadow damage that you do to them will gain this bonus. So it's not just like an increase to all of your damage, it is very specifically shadow damage, and the debuff is triggered by a darkness skill. So if we were to use Reap as our darkness skill here, attacking 3 times would mean that we have the maximum amount of stacks, and theoretically, as long as we attack at least once every 2 seconds or less than that, we should maintain this total bonus. We'll get back to why I made that such a nuanced statement later on in the video, but that's the cruft of what we're talking about here. I should have an 18% total damage bonus against this boss training dummy, and I just don't. And here's where the Excel sheets come in. I'm not going to bore you with all of the details, but basically I'm running you through what the first set of testing looked like. We took a regular dummy, we hit it 50 times with a darkness skill being Reap, and we recorded all those damage numbers. We got an idea of what the average, the min, the max, the median was, whether or not our min and our max were within the 50% weapon damage variance and the 20% skill damage variance. It was. And then we compared that against different sets of criteria. So the next set of criteria that we compared against was damage with the Gloom stack fully up. So we would hit 3 times, theoretically having the maximum stacks of bonuses, and then record another 50 data points. We checked again against an elite dummy, and then we went and ran the exact same test, but we tested it against the boss dummy. Theoretically, covering every single thing that we would need to see to make sure what the data that we got was representing was accurate. So when we look at our base damage versus our damage with the Gloom buff, we're going to be looking at the difference here, the difference in our average, the difference in the min, the max, and the median. What you saw is that it actually overperformed. So it looked like we were actually gaining a 22% damage bonus if we looked at the average damages. If you looked at the minimum or the maximum, we got somewhere around that same range of about 22% increased damage, and then similarly for the median, which makes sense. Now, the reason why this is overperforming is mostly due to 2 pretty easy issues, but it's pointing us in the right direction. One, using the 2-digit data set that I'm using right here doesn't allow for the variance in rounding to really be accounted for, which is something that Ava pointed out to me, and I appreciate that they did. That being said, it's still strong enough to be able to point to like, hey, we are getting an at least 18% damage bonus out of using Gloom. And as long as we don't continue to see this like overperformance of that damage boost, we shouldn't assume that anything irregular is happening. Similarly, comparing these numbers against the elite target dummy, we saw anywhere between a 15 to 20% damage increase. Again, within the range and variance of what we're expecting an 18% damage value to increase our overall damage by. Makes sense. Perfect. Good. It's working. Damage with Gloom against a boss, 50 data points, and what you see is that we are not getting anywhere near these 18 to 20% damage increases. And again, we don't want it to be greater than 18%. but we're not even coming close. The difference in our average only allowed for a 13% damage increase, and it's the difference in min and max, which is something I want to drill on again in a little bit. I'm sorry for dragging you along, but it's important that you understand how I got this data. But the difference in min and max was only showing an increase of 6 to 7%, and then the damage in the average was showing about a 13%. Now, there's a universe where like the variance in my data, not having enough data points here, and the rounding errors could account for some of this, but not a difference of 6 to 18% damage increase. That would be pretty nutty. Something fundamentally wrong with how I was doing the testing would be the only thing that would lead to that. So what do you do in a circumstance where 50 data points across 4 different test sets isn't enough? Well, you double it and you go ahead and you get 100 damage instances across base damage and damage against a boss and compare those. That's when we're looking in column F and G. And as you can see, we went and doubled the total amount of data points that we got. So we get our average from damage against the boss. We get our average of damage without Gloom against the target. And what we see is a 10% increase in damage. So again, not an 18% increase. For the min and the max, again, we're only seeing a 6 and 7% increase here. And then obviously the median, which is similar to the average, is showing a 14% damage increase. So we've at least proven one thing. We're not getting the full damage boost from Gloom against a boss. But I don't like that our minimum and maximum are continuously underperforming even what the underperforming nature is of Gloom for the average. I don't like that. There's something weird happening there. But just as Ava pointed out and what I alluded to previously, having a data set that only goes to the second digit doesn't allow for a lot of rounding errors to be able to be accounted for and actually captured in our data set. Because it turns out after 100 data points, I was consistently getting a minimum and a maximum of 33 and 54 respectively. After adding on an additional 50, because at one point I went up to 150 data points for both sets of tests, I actually found a new maximum damage value, which means that there was just some rounding errors continuously causing me to not see this data point. So that's very good, right? We want to make sure that we're at least capturing things to an effective level. So we bumped it up to 3 digits, put on a bigger weapon, ran the exact same test again with another 100 data points. And as we scroll down through the 100 data points, we get down to the bottom and we get our last findings, at least for this test. So comparing using Gloom versus not using Gloom against a boss, what we see is that, again, only about a 10% increase in the average damage, a 7% increase in the minimum damage, about a 9% increase in the maximum damage, and then again, a 10% increase in the median damage. So what does that point us to? Well, take all these numbers and what you get is roughly a 9% expected increase from using it and not using it against a boss. So just half effective against bosses for whatever reason. I can't figure out why. There's just no universe where I can actually figure out why this is the case. Now you might say something like, well, a boss probably has different damage reductions against the target. A boss is at a different level, or a boss probably has like hidden mechanics. Sure, absolutely fine. We should expect that like bosses literally take less damage than non-bosses, right? But the difference in that damage should be consistent. We should see an overall reduction in our damage. We shouldn't see a reduction in the bonus given to us by presumably a static variable, which is the Gloom debuff. Here's where we get into a place of pure speculation, and if that's all you really wanted to learn, you can effectively stop watching this video. Thank you so much for stopping in. I hope that this was helpful, but I want to talk about something that is a thing that I have reported to the developers before. I ultimately hope that it changes, but we're actually going to go look at the aspect disobedience to get a better idea of what I'm talking about here. Disobedience says that you gain a stack of increased total armor, and that lasts for 4 seconds whenever you deal damage, stacking up to a total of 60. So you can get a total of 60 stacked bonuses. Now, I don't know if you've ever watched your disobedience stacks or your armor inside of a real combat situation in the game, and realized that they all fall off individually. It's not one big buff that you're maintaining. It is up to 60 total individual 4-second timers. Why? I have no idea. It's absolutely insane. But let me show you in game because it'll make a lot more sense. So I'm going to use Reap, and you'll notice that I get a disobedience stack here, and then after 4 seconds, it's going to fall off. Now, if I do it twice, I get 2 stacks, and then you'll notice that it's going to drop down to 1 and then fall off from me. Let me just sit here and attack continuously, because I would assume, just like you should assume, that as long as I'm continuously attacking, I should continuously stack up disobedience all the way up to the maximum, and then if I were to wait 4 seconds, they should all fall off, right? Wrong. So I'm going to sit here attacking. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7. Each individual stack, like I just said, has its own timer. You do not maintain a constant buff that has 1 4-second timer. No. Each individual stack. That's why you might have noticed, especially playing on something like Bone Spear, where your spear hits multiple targets and all the shards hit multiple targets, that your disobedient stacks are going crazy bananas all the way out throughout a dungeon, a vault, whatever you happen to be fighting. Just like disobedience, we also have Frenzied Dead aspect. This says that every single time one of your minions attacks, they're going to gain 14% increased attack speed for 3 seconds, up to a total maximum. And if you've been following like summoner builds and the development of that meta since the game's inception, there's always been a lot of bugs being reported about Frenzied Dead. Seemingly you don't maintain the attack speed even if your monsters are continuously attacking. And I think it actually is because it suffers very similarly to disobedience, where I think that for whatever reason, these types of buffs maintain an individual timer per stack. So even though your minion might be attacking continuously, that first stack is falling off, and then your attack speed is slowed, and then you regain that stack, but then the second stack falls off, and then you get the third, and then that stack falls off. This is why I would also attribute to the stack seemingly falling off very quickly in between combat, because it can't just be that each one has its own individual timer and then nothing else happens, right? What happens if I have maximum stacks and then I attack again? Does it refresh the last stack? Does it refresh the first stack? That can't be the case because the stacks are falling off as we go. So if it was perpetually just refreshing the first stack and pushing it along, theoretically the buff should stay the entire time as long as you are attacking. So Frenzied Dead and Disobedience both seem to work in this way, where the stacks are actively falling off even as you are performing the action that the aspect says is required to maintain the buff. I believe, and it's very, very hard to test this, right? Because I would need to be able to have a timer going that would have multiple instances of 4 seconds and then individually record attacks per data point, like each data point per attack stack that I assume is currently on the target, to be able to show the difference of whether or not I'm getting the full bonus that you would expect. I can't think of a real game, like real human way of being able to do this without a robot having multiple timers going and literally running this with like a tool assisted program or something. If you can come up with a way, please let me know. I would love to be able to test this. But I think that Gloom stacks are working the same way as Disobedience and Frenzied Dead. And I'm going to point to my data to theoretically show how that would work, because that's my best guess as to why we're not seeing a consistent damage increase across all of the different ways you can measure the data, right? The min, the max, and the average. Obviously, the average is going to be the strongest piece of data, but the min and the max, given enough data points, should be strong enough to be able to show a lack of variance. Like it should be able to show the same increase. And I was just consistently not getting that. But you might have seen while we were scrolling by this little set of data right here, which is its own headache, and I'm going to complain about it in a quick second. But basically what I did was I recorded myself attacking over like a 7-second period, and then I recorded how many frames, 60 frames in a second, it took for me to actually successfully deal damage with a darkness skill, theoretically applying a stack to the target. So we start our animation 43 frames into this recording. By the 65th frame, I've successfully hit them. That's a total of 22 frames into Reap's animation. Like I can literally show you us looking at it, but like watching this animation frame by frame, 22 frames into Reap's animation is when it actually deals damage and applies effects. That's super slow, in case you're wondering. Bone Spear occurs in 16 frames, just to give you a comparison point, but that's kind of neither here nor there. The first hit lands on the 65th frame of the recording. Theoretically, for 2 seconds, I should have the buff, meaning for 120 frames, I should have the buff. So I should expect this buff to expire 185 frames into this video, into the recording that I had, if it's working the way that I believe that it is. The second hit occurs on the 102nd frame, so we should have 2 stacks up at this point, and that should fall off at the 222nd frame. Third hit lands 141, so I theoretically should have all 3 stacks at this point. None of them should have fallen off. The fourth hit lands on 178. This either replaces the first stack or replaces the last stack, which is what I think is actually happening. And then in between this hit and the fifth hit, the first stack of Gloom should have fallen off. On this hit, since the stack should have fallen off, we should now be looking at the second hits timer, the refreshed third hits timer, and then a new first hits timer, meaning that for the next hit, all 3 of them should be active, so on and so forth. You should effectively hit these valleys where even if you are continuously attacking, if it works like Disobedience and Frenzy did, you're not actually maintaining the full damage bonus against the target. And that's what I believe is contributing to the underperformance of the damage boost on minimum and maximum damage in my data set here. In a perfect world with enough data, with variance being minimized to like the utmost degree, these 3 numbers should effectively all be the same. We should see the same increase for the minimum damage, the same increase for the maximum damage, and the same increase for the average damage because it is a static variable. That's just not what I was seeing in my data. Have I proven anything? No, not at all. This is actually just something that I want to throw out to the developers since I know other things in the game work this way and it's wildly unintuitive and ultimately means even if you are successfully applying the effects that you want to, you're not getting the full benefit of them all the way throughout a combat experience as long as it goes on for long enough. But on top of that, it's just confusing, right? I don't think anybody assumed that disobedience stacks would fall off individually over a total of 50 stacks and that you would never really have the total bonus even if you were perpetually in battle, right? You would expect you to get the full buff and then maintain that full buff until it ran out. If that is true, how many other things in the game work with stacking buffs that all have their own individual timers where you're not consistently getting the same damage out of them depending on how long it's been since you applied the first one? It's really hard to say, right? Maybe there's a better skill or a better combination of aspects and effects that would make it very easy to be able to test this in game. And if we could prove that they all work like that, I would like to petition the developers to change that. It's horrible. Why would it ever work like that? Even just like the processing power of maintaining that many individual timers simultaneously on a target, given enough people attacking that same target, like a world boss, etc. There's no way it's not leading to issues. I don't like to just like conspiracy theory up like, oh, everything's broken because of this. But when I first learned that disobedience worked in that way, I thought it was terrible. Similarly to Frenzy Dead, and now I think it might work like this for Gloom too. But I'd like to hear from anybody who believes that they found a way to be able to prove it, because I don't want it to be pure speculation. I want to be able to put out data to be able to defend this point so that, again, I have a stronger leverage to be able to go to the developers and say like, hey, that should probably be different. And I just wanted to share that with you all. Thank you very much again to Ava making me aware of this. I sure do love finding new bugs that mean that like my favorite forms of the Necromancer are just strictly weaker than they should be. And I'd love to hear from you all as well. Do you believe that you have identified any interesting bugs? Have you run into this before? Have you noticed this in some weird way and you couldn't quite put your finger on it? Let me know down in the comments. If you're brand new here and you like what you're seeing, consider subscribing to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And if you are already here and you did like it, if you click the like button, it tells YouTube to tell the advertisers to tell me, hey, good job, this is a great video, we're going to show it to more people. So I would really appreciate that as well. But as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.